All right. Would somebody be willing to lead us in prayer as we get started?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Go ahead, Anthony. Thank you.
God, we come to you this morning appreciative of the opportunity to be involved in life, to make decisions and to grow and to learn. Mm-hmm. It can be overwhelming at times. It's tempting to want to run away from it all from time to time, but help us to trust you and help us to lean into what you have for us. Thank you for fellow students in this course. Thank you for our professors and their love of learning and for their gracious ways with us. We ask your blessing on the moments we have together, that they could be productive and helpful and informative and would be honoring to you. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Anthony. All right. All right. Well, we are, what are we in? Week 5. So we're halfway through the course. I thought we would just take a few minutes and just talk about that. Your chapter 1, I'd ask you in the discussion forums this week just to kind of indicate any issues that you were maybe struggling with that you'd maybe like to just talk about a few minutes before we move into some other matters today. So let's just have an open mic. I'll watch the chat room to see anybody putting messages there.
Well, I'll start off if nobody else is. I'm wondering if you can give any guidance on project design. It seems to be my current area where I'm having a challenge making some decisions about how to execute the project. There are a couple of options that seem to fit, but I'm just wondering if there are some typical clues that really guide you into what your project design wants to be. Some of them seem fairly exotic to me, and there seems to be some fluidity to the definitions. So that's one question. And then the second question is, that's an awfully cute baby, Melvin. Sorry, I was distracted.
Oh yeah, I see him there.
And then the second thing is variables in a qualitative research project. I'm wondering maybe if we can circle back and just sort of look at that a bit. So I'll throw out those two items unless somebody has something more pressing.
Yeah, we could just kind of briefly talk about those issues. We'll get into those issues a lot more specifically when we get into the research methodology chapter in a few weeks. But I'll just make a few initial comments, and Dr. Henry could possibly make a few. As I look at the two major research methods, qualitative and quantitative, each has its own purpose. When I think of a quantitative method, which I haven't studied as much, I think Dr. Henry's probably got more expertise in that area than I do, but a quantitative approach is used to look at trends. We use the term how variables are spread across a particular population, which simply means, if you have a variable, you're trying to determine how that variable is demonstrated as a particular percentage, et cetera, of a particular population. I was thinking, say, for example, your project, Anthony, you're dealing with, the planning process in specifically Southern Baptist churches, I think in the Tucson, Arizona area, if I remember correctly. A quantitative approach, you may want to just find out what's going on in terms of various churches in that area in terms of their use of planning, and you maybe would design a quantitative survey which has true, false, yes, no, or multiple choice. They're closed-ended types of questions. Using that quantitative approach, your variable is what. How can we even define a variable? It would be something to the effect that how is planning, is a strategic planning or a data-driven planning process used within specific Southern Baptist churches in the Tucson area. You would get at that information with a quantitative survey, okay, multiple choice, closed-ended. After you've done that kind of a survey, and I don't know how many churches that would involve, but for a quantitative study, you want to have a representative sample of that group so that you have a fairly representative set of results. Qualitatively, then you may, if you were going to do a mixed method, you may determine you're going to interview 15 or 20 of those pastors in some way. You maybe interview on the phone or whatever you can work out, because you want to understand a little more in depth what kinds of planning they use or don't use, what do they think about certain kinds of processes, how useful are they in their particular setting. So, then you would do a follow-up, with a qualitative approach. So, that would be my first, my first response. I don't know, others, Dr. Henry, others would like to, jump into that conversation.
In response to Anthony's question, with regard the first part of the issue, I would say that in terms of project design, what we are seeking to teach you and to encourage you to do is that when you think of designing a project, you need to think in terms of asking the right questions, and that is the research component to the project. Many times when people think of doing a project, I think the basic approach is usually, I know the answers that we need here. Let me design a program. Let me put in place a strategy that will give the results that we assume are needed. However, good project design should start with our ability to ask the right questions. And that is, for many of us, that is time consuming and stressful, and we don't move fast enough. However, the ability to ask the right questions will lay the foundation for the results. And in the process of asking those questions, allowing yourself to be open-minded, allowing yourself to receive whatever answers come to you. And then, as a result of that, you can start to think about a strategy that you will develop to address whatever problem it is that you want to address. And I just want to point Anthony and the class to two texts that are in our recommended reading. One is Beyond Change Management by Anderson and Ackerman and Anderson, and the other one is The Change Leaders Roadmap. The second one, The Change Leaders Roadmap, takes you more into the how-to of project design for change. But if you are committed to project design, I highly recommend that you use these two texts as part of your reading and understanding. Okay, I think the second issue that you raised, and Anthony, and you could clarified for me somewhat is about the variables. So could you restate that so I can respond to you appropriately?
Sure, sure, I'll try. I, my focus is really not quantitative, although there may be some quantitative analysis in it. But if I'm reading the information right, you would like to see, or the project would like to see, a statement of the variables, even in a qualitative approach. And that is a little fuzzy to me, I must confess. It feels like everything is a variable in a qualitative study. It seems like everything could move, so to speak. Perhaps the survey I designed or the questionnaire I designed is not a variable. Perhaps the person's response is a variable. But I'm wondering if you could add a little more light to that. I don't want to hijack the whole morning, but I'm just wondering if you could add a little light to my understanding, or perhaps point me toward a resource. It seems like Miriam and Criswell and these resources, they touch on that, but they don't really deal with it fully. So I'm wondering if you could provide some help. Thank you.
Okay. In terms of the variables, in the quantitative study, you start out with a clear identification of the variables because you generally are measuring to see to what extent these variables are present and how they are related to each other. So we start off the quantitative study with a clear identification of the variables, because basically in the quantitative study, we are testing to find the variables or to see what are the relationships between variables or to predict the relationship between variables, etc. In the qualitative study, the issue of the variables is more open-ended and comes towards the end of the study, in the sense that the results of your study, your qualitative study, will point you to the variables, the possible variables that you would need to look for in a follow-up study. Because the qualitative study will bring to the surface the significant variables. And then you can propose now to do a study, perhaps a quantitative study, to see how these variables are interrelated, how they're defined, etc. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think so. Because I've really been spinning on this point, struggling, and it makes sense that I would say, okay, here's what I've learned through the research process. This needle doesn't seem to move. These needles vary wildly. So here's what we might do next in another study. Or here's how we might anchor that one. Maybe this issue is an independent variable. And these others are dependent. So we could shape another project based on that understanding. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And then I really serve those up at the end of the project, not at the beginning of the project.
Sure.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, any other issues that we can deal with quickly before we move on this morning? This morning here anyway, in my part of the world. Yeah, I think, like I said, we will get into the research methodology section a little more in a few weeks. But I think, as Dr. Henry has said, in the qualitative approach, the variables grow out of the research, as do the theories. Technically, I think I mentioned, Creswell indicates that we don't have any theories in a qualitative study, that they have to all emerge out of the interview, out of the surveys, whatever you're doing. Miriam would say, she said, no, in a qualitative approach, there are theories. They're just not being tested so much in a qualitative. When we talk about the fact that we've put together a theoretical framework, there are certain theories, certain disciplines that we are bringing into our project right from the beginning. But so if we use theory in that sense, but as Miriam is saying, there are going to be theories that we're utilizing in a qualitative approach, but we're not necessarily testing those theories as we may do in a quantitative approach. And I think, as both those authors say, sometimes the lines can be blurred a little between quantitative and qualitative, and I think that's very true. Even when you design a particular survey, you may have some closed-ended questions and some open-ended questions. So technically, you're using both qualitative and quantitative approaches, within the same survey. So we've got to make sure we don't get too focused on the issue that we just have two very distinct kinds of methodologies. There's going to be a little bit of blending there. But for the purposes of talking about research, we bring forth those categories. We say quantitative basically uses numbers, quantities, testing percentages, testing theories. Qualitative is a little more in-depth to dig into an issue, a little more fully than we may say do in a quantitative approach. All right. Let's go ahead and move on. What I thought we would do today, let me ask you, Dr. Henry, were you able to find anything on critical thinking in terms of PowerPoints?
Yes, there's a lot on critical thinking.
Okay.
And I have found.
Okay. I'm going to just say a few words about the transformational strategy, and then if you're able to share some thoughts on critical thinking, and then I can jump in, any content that I have. But I don't want to spend too much time on let me just share my screen a moment. I did put this, let's see, that's the one we want right there. Just trying to rearrange my screen here so I don't have so much clutter on it. Okay, in the purpose statement, there is a section called, the transformational strategy. I think a truth that at least I've been coming to a little more strongly, even this term, as Dr. Henry and I have been working through some of these concepts. The transformational strategy, of course, is a central piece of a BGU dissertation. It's a required component. That is not necessarily a required component in a PhD program. PhD programs are becoming more practical and more. We're working on a PhD. Dr. Henry is heading up a PhD program, for BGU, which will also have a practical transformational focus. Okay, but traditionally, you have two kinds of degrees. You've got the more academic degrees, which for the PhD has generally been considered, an academic kind of degree, which focuses on research and trying to add new knowledge, developing skills within that whole area, where professional degrees have been more focused on problem solving, on applying knowledge to specific situations in order to arrive at a satisfactory solution. Applied knowledge, I guess, is what the professional degrees, our DTL, our DMin are both professional degrees. An education degree, a doctor of education, is considered a professional degree. We have a faculty committee going on right now that we're kind of wrestling through some of these issues in terms of a professional degree and an academic degree. And again, those lines are becoming blurred, okay? But I just bring that up to say that the transformational strategy has been an essential component for the BGU doctorates ever since I've been associated with the school, which is actually from the beginning. So the idea that we have had at BGU is that a project must culminate in some kind of a practical application of the knowledge of the research that you've done. Okay. I think what we've been trying to do over the last couple of years, we're trying to strengthen the research component because we feel like we've been a bit weak on that component in our dissertations. And so having brought on board, faculty members like Dr. Henry, Dr. Martin, who've done quite a bit more, say, in the area of research, I think they're helping us strengthen some of the research components, research data gathering, for example, and trying to think through our research methodologies as strongly as we think through our transformational strategies, which I think, we've been fairly good at as a school. So with that all said, let's just talk about this transformational strategy a bit. As I've already said, all dissertations need to culminate in a transformational strategy. Let's go down here. For the purposes of a BGU dissertation, the transformational strategy should be implemented within a specific time period with a beginning and an ending date. The strategy may lead to future similar projects, but you need some specific part of a strategy that you can implement and test within the time frame of the dissertation. This strategy should also involve a team effort of some type in line with the BGU value of collaboration. In designing an effective transformational strategy based on the research work you do through the project, you should ask yourself the following questions. What is the situation now? What would the situation look like if the problem were solved? What beginning steps do you need to take to begin to address the problem? And who are other people with whom you can network in order to address the issue? And so a transformational strategy is just that. It's designed to begin some kind of a transformational process within the context where you're working, whether it's a community, an organization, or similar kind of context. I mean, I think you're probably all familiar with, the SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Again, these are the kinds of questions that you could apply to a situation. Strengths, what does an organization or a community or a person, what do they do best? We use the term appreciative inquiry, looking at what are the positive qualities. Weaknesses, what are the weak areas? Opportunities, what opportunities exist in your situation that you're addressing that would help you address this problem, and what are the threats? What potential issues can negatively impact your project? And some of these you'll get at through research, through surveys, through interviews. You're going to understand strengths, weaknesses, opportunities. So the research you do is hopefully going to be bringing more clarity to what is actually needed in a particular situation to bring about transformation. And sometimes I think students have been a little guilty of entering a project, and they just immediately start thinking of the transformation strategy they want to use, and then they tend to deal with the research component lightly. And that's what we're trying to discourage, I think, at this point, is that we make sure that we go into the research component part of your dissertation project with a little more of a clean slate in terms of your mind, okay? Trying to ask questions, trying to figure out what it is you need to know. You're always going to have in mind, what is it that I can be doing in this situation to bring transformation? And that's fine. You have that in your mindset because that's part of your ultimate goal. But don't let that thinking focus on a transformational strategy possibly blind you to some possibilities you may not have thought of, because you have some preconceived ideas of what you want to do. But anyway, a SWOT analysis is one form to understand what maybe you may need to be doing in a particular community. We talk about the appreciative inquiry approach, the 5D model, which has been used to improve both communities and organization. If you've been at BGU for a while, you've probably heard the appreciative inquiry, the AI approach, the 5Ds. Definition, we're selecting the area of concern to be addressed in a particular area. Discovery, we're determining how people see the issue and discovering people and other resources that can be helpful in addressing the issue. Okay, these two issues happen quite a bit at the research phase as we're trying to understand how people see a situation, an issue. You go into the third D, the dream, which simply means to imagine what might be as people and resources are brought together for a positive result. And so the dream phase is kind of that brainstorming phase that may take place. And of course, we want collaboration going on. So, we don't want you just to be kind of imagining on your own what might happen. We really emphasize collaboration at BGU. Who are the people in a particular network that you're a part of that can help you and work together with you in a collaborative way to be thinking about your situation, your community, your organization, whatever the focus is of your project. Then you get into the design phase, developing the processes and the activities needed to effectively bring about a positive result. Okay, and so you've done your research, you've gotten a lot of data, you've analyzed the data, you know what people are thinking, feeling, what other leaders are possibly doing, thinking, what kind of resources are possibly involved in terms of your setting. With and some of those kinds of ideas in your mind, you can then start the design phase, which is developing the processes and the activities needed to effectively bring about some positive results. And of course, we all realize that when you begin working on a transformational strategy, that strategy is most likely not going to solve the problem in one dissertation. What we're expecting is that you'll be designing some kind of a strategy that begins to address the issue. A popular strategy that has been used at Bakke Graduate School, which was kind of developed by Ray Bakke, kind of the person who has helped found some of the issues we do here. A city consultation, that's a form of a transformational strategy whereby you would seek to recruit some of the major leaders in an organization or a community to begin to brainstorm on some of the issues. When I lived in Seattle, and I was where the school actually started, we would do city consultations within the city of Seattle. We would do many city consultations with a class, just to give our class a sense of what a city consultation looks like. And that city consultation, we maybe would bring in the city mayor, the city police chief, educational leaders, church leaders, other civic leaders that would maybe have some input into what's going on in a city. And we would bring those people together for a day-long workshop. And we would bring in speakers, different ones would give presentations. We would then break up into small groups based on issues that kind of emerge out of the city consultation, crime, gang activity, whatever it might be that's happening. People who have an interest in particular areas, we broke them up into small groups, and they began to do strategizing in terms of what could happen in that city to begin to address these problems. And we'd come back together again and do more thinking together, and then we would leave that city consultation, each task group with an agenda that they were going to work on. And then we may agree to come back together again at some future date and begin to compare notes and determine what was going on. That was a city consultation, which was a type of transformational strategy, okay? And so I just use that. That would be part of the dream stage, imagining what could be, and the design stage. Well, the design stage was putting together a city consultation. In our handbook, you'll notice that process is fairly well laid out in the final project handbook. Our president, Dr. Brad Smith, had worked that process through in a written form, especially for DTL students working in community transformation or organizational transformation. So you can look at those in the handbook to get an idea what that kind of a transformational strategy might look like. Now that's just one form of a strategy, okay? Some students have designed educational programs. I have a student right now in Guyana. Where is Dion? Is Dion Guyana? Yeah, Dion is in Guyana. Anyway, he was working on water treatment plants in the area. And he's put together, a whole course, because a lot of water treatment engineers were not really trained well in some of the water treatment issues. And anyway, so his transformational strategy was a whole educational curriculum that he was able to test parts of that curriculum within, as a part of his dissertation phase. So anyway, those are just the examples, and then, the design, the fifth stage of an AI and appreciative inquiry is the destiny delivery, implementing the needed processes to effectively bring about positive change. Okay, and so that's the 5D AI approach that is used by many people. Asset-based community development is another model that those of you who have taken that course from Dr. Kit Danley or maybe familiar with that whole model of looking at a community, and then that becomes a transformational strategy. This little triangle down here, always be aware that a project implementation triangle is always in place. As you increase the scope of a project, it increases the time, which increases the cost. There's just kind of a triangle that's used in business circles when you're planning out any kind of a project. That's just a few, brief comments on transformational strategy. I would like you just to have that in your mind. In that section under the purpose statement, you can possibly indicate something you're thinking about, but I really want you to make sure you indicate that although this is a possible strategy you've thought about, you want to make sure that you are being as, unbiased as possible as you go into the research, with the idea that as you're going through the research process, new ideas may emerge in terms of what would be an effective strategy for the situation that you're dealing with. And so it's kind of a balance at this point. You're going to have some ideas. I want you to have an idea of what a transformational strategy may look like, but at the same time, I really hope you can go into the research phase just kind of holding lightly any strategies that you've possibly thought about at this point in time. Let me just open that up for comments or questions before we move on from there.
Dr. Payne, it's Siobhan here.
Go ahead.
How do we balance out when new ideas do emerge that we don't end up expanding the project so much, the time cost, the time cost scope, that it just doesn't shift so much that the focus ends up somewhat changing?
Yeah, that's
the balance of it. What's the balance of that?
Yeah, that's always the issue when we're working with a transformational strategy. I think basically, what I try to think through, and as I look at transformational strategies, as you get into the project later, I can maybe give you more ideas. But if you can think of a way to confine a project, and I'm going to call it a mini project often, within the confines of, you've got about a 9 months to a year time to be working on a dissertation process right now. So whatever you're going to be doing, and you got to do the research to begin with, and then you're going to be doing some kind of a strategy that you're going to test. now, like I just mentioned, Dion, who's in our program right now, he designed a whole curriculum, but the transformational strategy, he just did a one-day workshop just to test out just one little piece of that curriculum. And so that little piece, he tested it, and then he wrote up the results of that little piece of the curriculum that he tested in a one-day workshop. That was appropriate for the dissertation process. He couldn't test the whole curriculum, at a school over a 12-week or a 2-term process, because there would be no time to do that within a dissertation process. So if you can think of some way to test even one piece of an overall strategy, that is one way to think about it, I think, that has been helpful to me.
Okay, so like an example with my project on fathering and the benefits of growth and development with kids.
Right.
I noticed that as I'm reading different research, I'm now beginning to explore the value it has for fathers, and then I'm also kind of now beginning to look at, okay, well, if it means something to fathers as well, what's the impact on mothers? And so I don't know if that's transformational strategy, or if that's just forming a well-rounded project, because, if the child is in a single parent home or a parent or a 2-parent home where perhaps fathering isn't done, or the mother is taking on so much more, I'm still wanting to explore what that looks like within the family unit. And then I think one of the recent questions I added even was what it looks like within the community. And so I'm like, should I even go that far out, or should I just keep it right here as it relates to kids? Or is it okay to open it up a little bit more as it relates to, because I wasn't even thinking about going as far as community. And now it's moved from the impact of growth and development on kids to what it does in the life, what it does for fathers, and then it's what it does for the impact on mothers, and now it's exploring like, how does that look, and is it the domino effect of, I don't know.
One of the things in your dissertation, like I say, there's a small piece that you're going to try out or test within the dissertation process. Let's say, I'm gonna just two ideas come to my mind in terms of the fathering. One could be a fathering seminar for those who would like to be a part of that, and you'd present some content, or someone would present some content, and that would be one transformational strategy. A strategy that I used to use in marriage counseling and when I was pastoring, I used mentoring, where I would take one couple who had maybe been a little more mature, and then I connected them up with another couple, and they would become a mentoring couple to another couple. You could do that with one father to another father, okay? So, you could try that out, and that's just two ideas that, come to my mind. And I would probably say for your dissertation, you'd probably want to keep it limited. I would not go to the community yet. At least that would be my perspective. In the last chapter of your dissertation, there's a section where you talk about what kinds of future research or projects could grow out of your research and out of what you've done in this particular dissertation. That would be the place to begin to talk about maybe some of the aspects of how the whole issue affects the community, and that would maybe possibly become a whole nother research project. So I would try to keep it focused, and so at least in your case, it seems to me you'd maybe want to keep it focused within your context and not get out into the community too much at this point in time. But that would be my recommendation right now.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and move on. I had asked Dr. Henry if she could find some PowerPoint slides on the concept of critical thinking. You will notice in our in all of our syllabi now, we have a section toward the end of all syllabi that says that critical thinking needs to be demonstrated in all of your course projects, and then ultimately now within your your dissertation project. And critical thinking is one of those terms that can be a little vague. Okay, there's been a lot of books written on the idea of critical thinking, and it depends on who you're looking at. I've done presentations on that, but I was hoping I'd like to be able to see some other presentations before I kind of give my thoughts. So I've asked Dr. Henry to lead us a little bit on that whole area of critical thinking. So let's change gears now and do some focus on that area, and we'll talk about how that maybe relates to our projects. So Dr. Henry, go ahead and share with us.
Okay, I've just sent to each of you a definition of critical thinking. Critical thinking is the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and/or evaluating information gathered from or generated by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication as a guide to belief and action. One of the foundational reasons or expectations of education is that we will develop critical thinking skills. That is foundational, and over we are having the discussion, the debate, the reflection on how well are we doing in terms of developing critical thinking skills through our educational processes. Now, the fact that you are where you are in this program and you are at a place where you are about to do research is a measure of your critical thinking skills. And the process of doing research does two things. It further develops your critical thinking skills, and it tests your critical thinking skills. And it does those two things at the same time. So you know more about critical thinking than you think you probably do because of your years of educational experience, etc. But coming to this major piece of your educational experience, that is doing research, has within it a deliberate challenge to your own critical thinking skills. So I begin there. Now, in this process, we've already been doing critical thinking. For example, we spent, I think, 2 weeks working with you and you communicating with each other in terms of the questions of your research. And by now you recognize that this is a foundational piece, and it is not as easy as you came into the process believing it was. So that is, and then we've talked about assumptions, and assumptions are important in when we come to look at critical thinking, because when we talk about assumptions, we are doing what academically we call metacognition. We're looking at the thinking behind our thinking. Why are we reasoning this way? What are these assumptions that we bring to the table? Recognizing that your assumptions are likely to bias how you approach the study. And that is why we've talked much about assumptions. And in the context of research, you have to be able to state your assumptions. Assumptions are always there. The issue is, are you aware of your assumptions? What are these assumptions? And are you aware of how these assumptions are likely to influence how you approach whatever study you're doing? So with that in mind, let me stop to allow you to ask any questions or make any comments, and then I'll share with you a PowerPoint presentation on critical thinking. Questions, comments?
I'll just make one comment, and I think a key word there that Dr. Henry mentioned is assumptions. That if we base, say, a whole model of activity on faulty assumptions, then of course, we're going to have a faulty model. And so, critical thinking is, as Dr. Henry has said, it's being able to analyze our assumptions and determining how we came to those assumptions. What kind of evidence do we have to support our assumptions? So yeah, there's just a whole process, I guess, of thinking about how we think. and I think that's another big issue for critical thinking, is the idea of being aware of our own biases, our own thinking, so that when we begin to analyze, we are aware of what we bring to the table in terms of our worldview, our perceptions, our assumptions, okay? So with that in mind, when we think of critical thinking, we're basically making sure that we are understanding our assumptions. And we can get into, if you looked at one of the textbooks I wanted you to read before you started this course was by Wayne Booth on research. And he goes through a whole process of what he calls academic arguments, okay? And before Dr. Henry shares, let me just share this one little slide, and then we'll move into Dr. Henry's presentation. If you remember in Wayne Booth's, when he said, when you're writing, say if you're going to be writing your literature review, you make a statement. Sometimes we just make a statement and we just take it for granted that the reader is going to agree with that statement. But Dr. Booth, he goes through this process of, when you say something, you make an assertion, okay? Servant leadership is a helpful concept for all organizations. Okay, that's my statement. Now, I could just take it for granted that everybody believes in servant leadership, okay? But that's my assertion. I need to give reasons why I think that to be the case, and then I need to give evidence in terms of statistics, expert opinions, historical issues. I may then give some opposing claims, opinions of others that accept or refute, and then I come to some kind of principles or conclusions in terms of what I've just said. That would be one sequential process of critical thinking, as say I'm doing writing in a dissertation. I'll just put that up, and this, of course, all of our slides will be on the recording, and you can take a look at these a little later. Okay, enough said on that. Let's go to Dr. Henry's PowerPoint slides on critical thinking.
Okay. what is critical thinking? This is an introductory slide, and I'm just going to scroll down to slide number 13 in terms of its relevance. There is just a volume of work out there on critical thinking, and in my own field, in the field of education, there are zillions of material written about critical thinking and how we need to and how we should teach towards critical thinking. So I've given you a definition, and now we will go into it some more. Let me just, critical thinking is a self-directed process by which we take deliberate steps to think at the highest level or quality. So thinking is, we usually assume, and that may be questioned, that thinking is automatic. We are constantly exercising the act of thinking. There are different levels of thinking. There are different qualities of thinking. Thinking, one writer says, is the ability to know how to make connections between ideas and to evaluate information critically. So that is a given. However, critical thinking moves you beyond just thinking. It's a qualitative description of the thinking that we are doing. This writer looks at thinking on two levels. One he calls the red thinking. The second one he calls the green thinking. He says the red thinking is the higher order executive functioning, the thinking that analyzes, assesses, and improves, what he calls the green thinking. The green thinking being the basic act of thinking, instinctive, automatic, spontaneous, unconsciously guided. So the lower level is the green thinking. The higher level, critical thinking, is about analysis and thinking to improve and to move beyond understanding, but analysis answers to the why question. Understanding is descriptive. Basically, we're looking at what is basic. But then when you start to ask questions about the what is, why is it the way that it is? What does this state of being mean for individuals, collectively, individually? Then we're moving into the realm of what we call critical thinking. And that's what we are all doing as we do research. Critical thinking is not new. In 1605, Francis Bacon wrote the first book on critical thinking. It was called, interestingly enough, The Advancement of Learning, in which he documented various forms of human irrationality and the need to establish new habits of thought through education. So there was always this awareness that critical thinking needs to be taught, and that education is one of the key factors towards facilitating and enabling and developing people in the area of their critical thinking. Socrates, 2,400 years ago, discovered by a method of probing questions, and today we talk about the Socratic method, that people often could not rationally justify their confident claims to knowledge. Okay. The green thinking, he classifies as the unconscious mixture of high quality and low quality thinking. It's spontaneous, it's impulsive, it's reflexive, subconscious, self-protecting, self-validating, uncontrolled, analyzed. It includes ideas that are valid as well as nonsense, confusion, etc. Green thinking is what we all do most of the time, and that's okay. It's not a value statement on the quality of thinking. It's just a description of thinking that is everyday thinking that we all live with. Green thinking goes without assessing itself. Now, red thinking, critical thinking, is where we start to do reflection. And we start to ask ourselves questions like, why are we thinking the way that we are thinking? What has happened in our life? What experiences do we have or have we had that has led us to think the way in which we're thinking now? And then we start to compare our thinking with how other people around us are thinking, recognizing that our way of thinking is not, one, it's not unique, and two, it's not the only way to think. And one of the variables we talk about with respect to critical thinking is what we call perspective taking, the ability to take another person's perspective. A critical thinker has that ability and uses that ability. You're willing to say, okay, this is the way I view this issue. And of course, as a critical thinker, you're going to give the evidence to back up your position. However, you're also able to say, but you know what? There may be another way, or even better than that, there is another way. There is another approach. Let me see what that other approach is. Let me listen to the other person, especially if that approach is opposite to my own approach, especially if that approach stirs within me a negative emotional response. That is where your critical thinking skills have to kick in the sense that you have to be prepared to acknowledge and your assumptions, etc., and then put that aside and give yourself the space to listen to and to acknowledge the other person's position. And I usually say to myself that to understand somebody else's position does not necessarily mean that I agree with that position. But before you get to agreement, you have to understand. And sometimes what happens is that when we are faced with ideas, issues that we are opposed to or that we have a different take on, we go right to the place where we talk about agreement, when what we need to be able to do first is to acknowledge understanding. And the worst thing you could do is to get to agreement or disagreement without understanding. But I think that one of the basic characteristics of somebody who is open to critical thinking is that you want to be able to acknowledge the need for understanding before you get to agreement. So red thinking stops and assesses itself before going forward. It's disciplined, it seeks the truth, it's self-assessing, it's probing, it's self-correcting, it's critical thinking. In the red thinking mode, we actively work to eliminate prejudices, biases, dysfunctional thinking from our thinking, and we actively work on our thinking. We rigorously apply intellectual standards to our thinking. And I just pause to say here that sometimes when people think about thinking and critical thinking, we seem to, or we want to think of it as opposite to emotion. And, sometimes when we are, especially when we're in a debate or we are confronted with knowledge that for whatever reason we don't want to accept, we talk about the other person being too emotional, or we become quote unquote emotional. No, thinking does not negate what I call the heart response, which is emotions. And to be a critical thinker does not mean that you are without emotions. I think that is one of the common misconceptions out there with regard to what is critical thinking. And so we come to this important piece. The critical thinking mind is equal to what has been described as the educated mind, because one of the major reasons for education is to develop people who would think critically. And in terms of the substantive learning that we hope to produce through education, is we encourage reading, we encourage writing, applying knowledge, saying it, hearing it. Unfortunately, a lot of times we stop at reading and writing in the educational process. What is happening in terms of your research component here is that you have to move beyond just reading and writing. We have to do application. And I like to think of the transformational component of the research as one attempt to apply it, because knowledge means nothing if it is not applied. Okay. Critical thinking is not just something you add on to everything else. Rather, it's the way you do everything you do. Critical thinking is not something that you necessarily turn on and off. You turn it on when you're in the classroom and you turn it off outside of a classroom. A person who is a critical thinker takes that with him or her wherever you are. Now, critical thinking, the nature of it is that it is stressful, because you're always going to be having to recognize that your position is not necessarily shared by others, and maybe your position is not valid. And one of the things that a critical thinker needs to be able to do is to acknowledge his or her limitations. Okay, so we're going to stop here. I'm going to put the whole PowerPoint in the course so you could look at the whole thing, but I've just highlighted these parts. And then I want to share with you, that's not in a PowerPoint, I'll stop share here, but I just want to talk a little bit more about the question is, how do we improve our critical thinking? Certainly, as I said at the beginning, the act of doing research is going to definitely challenge you. It challenges all of us to critical thinking. We couldn't do research without some measure of critical thinking. But so what are some ways? And we're doing that right now in the process. First, ask basic questions. That is why we started out there. Ask questions. And there are good questions, and then there are dumb questions. A critical thinker needs to be able to ask the sharp, good questions. The second thing is question our assumptions. And we've been doing that in this process. The third thing, and this is not necessarily an order by which you develop critical thinking, but we're just looking at these 7 basic ways. Be aware of your mental processes. Why am I thinking the way that I am thinking now? What are the background issues that has impacted my current thinking? What experiences, life experiences, whether they be positive or negative? What books have I read? What processes, whether they be professional or family processes, that now influence the way I think. This writer says, a critical thinker is aware of their what we call cognitive biases and personal prejudices and how they influence seemingly objective decisions and solutions. Many times in our debate back and forth with each other, we talk about objectivity, and objectivity is important, but objectivity does not negate the reality and the importance of the subjective. Then another method we say is try reversing things. You hold a particular position, but try reversing that position in terms of what it would mean if you took the opposite perspective to the issue that you are addressing. And it's always good, though it's not always easy, and a lot of times it's stressful, but it's good to train yourself to be willing to look at the opposite perspective. We talk about perspective taking. Evaluate the evidence. Certainly we will be doing that as we do our research. What evidence do we have? And when we evaluate the evidence, we're asking questions about the source of the evidence. Whose evidence? Whose material are we using and why? How was it gathered, by whom, etc.? And that is a very important question in research. For example, and the writer here gives this example, a study showing the health benefits of a sugary cereal. You may be looking at such a study. On paper, the study may sound convincing, and it probably is. But then you learn that the study was funded by the same company that produces the cereal in question. So you have to stop and ask yourself the question, is this bias? Is it valid? So you always, when you look at research, you always have to look at the source. Who is doing the research and why? We usually ask you to look at the sample and the population. Who are the people that are used to gather your information? Why did you select that group of people as against a possible next group of people who could have been used? Because these are some questions that would help you to understand the results of the research. And then, of course, always remember to think for yourself. Don't let others do your thinking. No, that is simple, but it's not as easy as it sounds, especially in our current social media, hypermedia environment. There is so much information out there. We are smothered with information, and people have made all kinds of decisions on how to address the superabundance of information out there. Sometimes a lot of people have decided to ignore it. You ignore it to your own peril, of course. So you have to be able to manage the flow of information that comes to you, but you also have to do that with the aim of doing your own thinking. And as I said, that's not so easy to do. Then the last point is that we understand that no one thinks critically 100% of the time. That will give you a constant headache. Critical thinking is important. And in our professional lives, we certainly have to use critical thinking. But we would be fooling ourselves if we assume that we can do it 100% of the time. Okay, I'll stop here for any comments or questions.
This is Bill. I would refer you all to a chapter in the Merriam book. We were just a few minutes ago talking about the idea of developing good questions, which is a part of the critical thinking process. And Miriam has there's books. I've got some other books on, designing interview questions, etc. But there's a chapter in Miriam's, or chapter 5 of your text, which I think I've got that on the reading assignment for week 8. But if you ever want to take a look at chapter 5, I'm looking at page 118, and she just kind of categorizes 6 different areas that we might design questions in order to get at certain kinds of information. She talks about questions that deal with experience and behavior, questions that deal with opinions and values, questions that deal with feelings, questions that deal with the actual knowledge a person has, questions that deal with a person's background, demography, etc. She just kind of breaks some, I think she at least gives some good simplified thinking on developing questions and how we think about the kind of questions we're even seeking to ask people. So you might want to just take a look at chapter 5 even before week 8 if you're kind of thinking about even the process of developing your methodology. Okay, again, a lot of material to take in, I know. Again, this session is recorded, and Dr. Henry's PowerPoints will be on the in the files area of week 5, so that you can get at that critical thinking issue. Again, I would encourage you to go back and look at Wayne Booth's book on the art of research when he goes through the whole issue of developing academic arguments, which again is part of a critical thinking process. And I think that those are probably good. That's a good chapter review, even as you are putting together your literature review, which we'll be doing over the next few weeks. How you think critically when you're bringing in various sources that you're discussing as they're applying to your particular topic. Okay, we're out of time. Again, this week you do need to get your chapter 1 completely finished up, get that submitted. I'm looking at what you've submitted so far. I'll try to get feedback back to you today and tomorrow on what you have already submitted. Again, by the end of the week, try to have your chapter 1 done, because beginning next week, then you start working on the literature review chapter 2, and we will give you some presentations and discussions next week specifically on the literature review chapter. Okay, any other final questions before we need to close down the session today?
Dr. Bill, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Felicia.
Okay. I just have one question for this week's assignment. So do we put in the transformational strategy into this week's assignment in the purpose statement? Does it need to be extended? Because I thought we would have already written that already. Oh, that's the intervention strategy, right? So this is the transformation strategy that we need to write on top of that.
Yeah, I think, like I mentioned, if you have some idea of what you're thinking about in terms of a transformational strategy, you can mention that, but do mention in that section right now that, because the academic committee is going to look at this proposal. If you'll say something to the effect, these are some of my thoughts on transformational strategies, but I realized that the actual transformational strategies are going to need to emerge out of my research. And so if you just kind of have that disclaimer in that section, then the academic committee cabinet will kind of know what you're doing. But yeah, I think even as I've been doing a little bit of changing in my thinking on, how detailed we should get on the transformational strategy at this point. And so like in the research chapter right now, that transformational strategy is asking for a fairly detailed description. I'm thinking now at this point, we would change that in the research methodology chapter at the proposal stage, that we really don't want you to have a totally detailed process worked out at this point in time at the proposal. So again, for chapter 1, maybe just 2 or 3 sentences on what you're maybe thinking about in terms of a transformational strategy, but making the disclaimer that I realize what I'm actually going to do is going to grow out of my research.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I think with that, we're going to go ahead and end the meeting. Again, I noticed we need to get into the discussion. I think we've only, at least when I looked this morning, there was only one discussion post so far. So please try to get in and do some discussing with one another, and then keep moving and finishing out the chapter 1 for this week. All right, with that, this has been recorded. I will send out the link to you when that's finished up in a couple hours, and so you can re-see the video if you need to. And again, the PowerPoint that Dr. Henry presented will also be online in the files area of week 5. All right. Goodbye for now.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.